review a book what I'm going to talk about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's a Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author, five-time TEDx speaker, Success Magazine, an emerging entrepreneur, and the founder of BLU Talks, none other than Mr. Corey Poirier.
Wow, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited and stoked to be here.
Yes, and thank you so much for being part on Book 101 Review, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Thank you, Mr. Corey. And today let's talk about the writing process of all your books. You openly shared that you were not always an avid reader. In fact, your mother famously told you to read a book before writing one. What shifted inside you that book from the moment to writing your first word of publication?
Well, for me, I was definitely, I could say maybe whether I was born a writer or not, I think is subjective because I think you can be maybe born to do something that you're terrified to do and don't think you're good at. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, almost like getting into speaking, writing was a major fear of mine. And for 10 years, I kept saying, I'm going to release a book. I'm going to release a book. And I just never did it. And interestingly, what finally did it for me, Daniel, is that book that's on the screen that says Share Your Message with the World, which doesn't have my name in the front. It says Tony Gambone. That was a compilation or an anthology book. And I was invited and I invested to be in that book. And that's what changed everything because I kept stalling and thinking it was hard to write a book until I wrote a chapter in a book. And by writing that chapter and then publishing it, it showed me, oh my gosh, this is all that I was holding off for. Like, this is all it was. And once I wrote that chapter in that book, I literally within about 2 months released my full book. So it went from like 10 years saying I was going to and never releasing it to releasing a book months later after writing that chapter. And the other side is, I think, why I didn't write until later in life is I didn't understand this, how bad I was in grammar and writing. I didn't understand the difference between fiction and nonfiction by the time I graduated high school. Plus, I got a 49 plus one. So I think there was a part of me that doubted I could become a writer. But again, once I did that first chapter in that one book, I was like, this is what I've been waiting for, all this. This is what the fuss I've been making. And it changed everything because I was like, okay, I can do this. And that's sort of kind of what led to me putting out books. And, it went from 0 books to, if I include compilation and anthology books where multiple authors are involved, I think I'm approaching 40 now, from not being able to write that first book.
Keep up the good work, Mr. Curry.
Okay.
Before the books, before the TEDx talks, you were a musician and a comedian. How did those creative discipline, songwriting and stand-up shape the way you approach writing book versus someone who come out through traditional journalism or comedia?
I feel like probably in the storytelling side. So, as a stand up comic, as a professional speaker, now I'm not going to say every speaker or comic's a storyteller, but I believe the ones that do it well often are storytellers. And so you learn about the craft of storytelling both in speaking and comedy. But in comedy, what you also learn about is brevity, like how to keep the story short, how to get to the point quick. And I feel like those things serve me as a writer because when you're writing, well, at least when I'm writing, my writing is all it's story based. And so for me, I don't want to make it one story carry over 35 pages. So how do you tell a great story, maybe only in one page, that has a powerful punch or impact or takeaway from it? And I think from comedy, I learned both how to tell a story, but also maybe just as importantly, how to tell a quick story. And then I feel like the other piece that I learned is how to incorporate humor into your writing. Like in comedy, we're used to you say a line and then you pause and you hope you get the laughter. And
Mhm.
the science or the art is when you do that, how long do you wait to see if you get laughter before you go into the next joke? Because if you wait too long, it becomes awkward and it looks bad. And even you might have a heckler then. But if you don't wait long enough, you step, I call it, on your own joke. So in other words, they start laughing and you're already into the next joke. You've now stepped on your own laughter and ruined you getting more of it. So there's a certain science there. And I feel like book writing is the same. Like if you want to hit a note with a story, hit that note and then allow room for the pause. So you might finish the whole chapter with that powerful story because now it's like they have to turn to start a new chapter, and it's like you left them with that dead silence for just long enough. So I think I carried those things over from comedy into writing when it comes to books.
Very well said, Mr. Corey. I do have also Comedy 101. Please do listen. Comedy 101, wherever you listen your podcast. I'm a frustrated comedian, so my co host trying to teach me how to be a comedian. So you've been involved with over 40 books now. Looking back at the staggering volume, was there a specific aha moment when you first thought, I'm not just someone who writes, I'm an author?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point because there's definitely a difference between a writer and an author. Now, I'll go one step further and say it was the opposite for me. I would say I was probably the author first and then the writer second. And the reason I say that is because I think of an author as an authority, as they say, authors write in the name authority. But I think of an author as an authority in the sense that when you write the book on, let's say, I can see on the screen one of my books, get paid to speak. So when you write a book on speaking, you now become the authority on it. So I think honestly, if you write a good book and as soon as you write it, you become an author. That's just my take. Now, becoming a writer is a whole different beast. And I would argue there's a lot of amazing authors that aren't writers. There's a great story by Robert Kiyosaki, who wrote the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, where he said he sold 26 million books, but to this day, he's still not a writer. He said, I'm an author, but I'm not a writer. And he said, if you saw the first drafts of my books, you'd be like, how does this person how did this person pass English? Like, in other words, like he said, the writing is terrible. And he gets somebody to edit it into a great book. So for me, the reason I bring all this up was the moment that changed that I became, in my opinion, a writer was when I wrote the last book I've written, which is called The Enlightened Passenger, also on the screen there. And it's the book that we're working on right now into a feature film. We're going to be filming hopefully by July. And that book, for me, was the first moment I felt like a real writer. And the reason I say that is because of the people that provided endorsements. And they weren't like, hey, I'll write the endorsement for you and you just put your name on it. They actually sent me the endorsement. And so Richard Paul Evans, who's a 46-time New York Times bestselling author and wrote the book, his biggest book was The Christmas Box. He wrote the foreword. So in other words, not only did he not just put his name on something, he literally spent hours writing a foreword for the book. And then Mark Victor Hansen, who is with Chicken Soup for the Soul, they have 600 million books sold. Mark wrote an endorsement. And then Neil Donald Walsh, who wrote Conversations with God, wrote an endorsement. The reason I bring up those names is, in my opinion, those three are all writers. So, Conversations with God sold almost 20 million copies. Really well-written book. Chicken Soup for the Soul. The other books that Mark wrote as well were very much artistic books, I'll call it. Richard writes novels. And so for the three of them to kind of put their stamp on my book, and again, not one of those, because you probably know this, there's a lot of times endorsements are written where somebody just says, you write it for me and I'll put my name on it. This wasn't that. These people actually read the book. Neil Donald Walsh said, once it's out, send me a copy, and then I'm going to buy a bunch for my friends. So to have a guy that sold almost 20 million books say he's going to buy the books for his friends, huge. Richard Paul Evans wrote that he wished he would have wrote the book. And he said if it wasn't for me writing it, he was going to take it and write it himself. And then he said it reminded him of Og Mandino, who's one of my favorite writers of all time. And then Mark Victor Hansen, who was friends with Og Mandino, said it reminded him of Og Mandino. So, Danielle, I know that was a long answer, but the long answer was to say that's when I truly felt like a writer, when people I respected as writers said, this is good writing.
Indeed, Mr. Corey, your first foray in publishing was contributing a chapter to an anthology. For writers who look down on that road, what would you say about collaborative start build the foundation for your solo career?
Yeah, I mean, well, I would say it this way. First of all, there's a lot of anthology books, and it can be a different number of authors. You can have anthology books with 4 authors, 6 authors, 300. Well, I don't know if there's 300, but 75, 30, what have you. But what I would say to people is, how is an anthology any different than a co-author book? And Like, in other words, it's just a co-author book with more authors. But I just brought up Mark Victor Hansen and Jack Canfield. These guys were actually on were New York Times bestselling authors so many times that they got a Guinness Book of World Record for it. So is somebody going to tell them that selling 600 million books is just something to look down on? Meaning they were co-authors, just like an anthology book has co-authors. And look at the respect they earned, getting on the New York Times list. I think it was like 35 times or something like that. And then I would go, continuing down that path, and to look at a lot of the great books that were written with, let's say, a ghostwriter, and that's still like almost like an anthology. It's like two people coming together and bringing together a book that way. When I said Chicken Soup for the Soul, it's in fact the book itself is an anthology because it's all short stories from different people that they sent in. And so what I would say is, short anthology books have sold over 1 billion copies. And so to me, it's nothing to look down on. But secondly, there's a lot, I've seen it because we work with anthology books and authors that submit chapters. There's people that have put their whole life into that chapter. They put as much into that chapter as some other people put into their book. In fact, there are some people that put more into their chapter than the person that goes to write their book and then goes to AI and gets almost the whole book written for them. Or somebody that just, slaps 20 pages together and then puts it on Amazon and says it's a book. I would argue somebody that puts their whole life into that chapter of an anthology book is actually putting more into it than maybe an author of a book that isn't that great. So I don't think there's anything to look down on, is the short way of saying that.
You've interviewed over 7,500 world renowned leaders. At what point did you realize that your skill as an interviewer was actually a training you to become a better writer?
Well, I mean, that's a great question because thinking about when was the point, I feel like it actually happened after I'd started interviewing enough actual writers that were maybe entrepreneurs and speakers and what have you, but enough writers that I finally realized, hey, I've interviewed a lot of writers. So it was almost like when it became enough that I went, wow, I've interviewed a lot of my favorite writers. That was the point where I realized it was helping me become a better writer. And so when I say that, I mean, like, I think back to early on interviewing James Redfield, who wrote the Celestine Prophecy, or like I said, Richard Paul Evans, who wrote the Christmas Box, the late Zig Ziglar, who wrote so many great books as a speaker, like See You at the Top. Whenever I interviewed those people, and I was both picking their mind as a writer, like trying to learn from them on the writing side, and interviewing them as an entrepreneur and business owner, there's a point where I realized, wow, I'm learning a lot about writing from these speakers and coaches and healers. At the same time, where I probably really recognized it is once I started taking that into my writing. So it took me a while, Daniel, to realize that if we go back to stand-up comedy, if we go to speaking, if we go to interviewing, it took me a long time to realize that what makes maybe the books that I write myself, like the book of Why on the screen there, what makes it different is that I'm taking all of those maybe skills into writing that book. So it's not like a traditional book where it's just like A to Z. It's like that book has 3 sections and I'm coming at it like a comic. I'm giving the short stories and I'm adding comedy in. I'm coming at it like an interviewer. I'm saying when I interviewed so and so, this is what I learned from them. I'm coming at it like a speaker. Here's the 3 strategies I recommend you do if you want to find your purpose in life. And so I think it's like as I started interviewing more writers, I realized I was taking both what I learned from them about marketing and writing and what I learned doing the interviews and learned speaking and learned doing comedy all into my writing style. And then that Enlightened Passenger book is a parable. It's fictional. It's not a nonfiction. But again, what's good fiction if it's not storytelling? If it's not baked in a story. And then on top of that, with that book, it's a parable, but I teach life lessons in it. So again, I bring my speaker side into it. There's a lot of comedy in it, so I bring the comedy side in. So you got me thinking about the fact that I don't often think about how all of those come together to make a writing style. But I know the shorter question you asked was, when did I realize? And I think it was at a point where I was like, oh, I've done 2,000 interviews and 500 of those people are writers who've sold millions of books. Wow. What am I learning from them? And then taking that and putting it into my own books.
Mr. Corey, your first solo book, Conversations with, was essentially transcribed interviews formatted into a book. That's unconventional debut. What made you trust that process, and what did building a book from others voices teach you about finding your own?
Yeah, I mean, another great question, and by the way, great research as well. Those. So when I said that I did that anthology book, and then a couple months later I had my first book out, it was the book you're talking about. It was called. The first one was called Conversations with Atlantic Canadians. That was the very first one in the series, and the idea was, now I here's the big thing. I had written everything in the book. So I want to clarify for people, this wasn't me just grabbing somebody else's stories and dropping them in. What happened at the time is I had a newspaper as well, and I was interviewing these people for the newspaper. So I literally took the interviews I'd already written, like everything I'd written, interviews and articles and stories, and put them into the book. So I want to clarify, it was all my writing, and I compiled it. And there were a few that I did for the book, like a few that new ones I did for the book. But I thought it was an easier way to launch a book for a few reasons. One, it was easier to bring together because it was almost like having a blog that you've already written that you can just turn into a book. But secondly, I think the big piece was, it also meant that I had, if I profiled 75 people in the book, it also meant I had an audience of 75 that was going to promote the book with me. So it wasn't just me promoting it on my own. So from a marketing point of view, it made sense. Next piece is, I really love highlighting other people's stories. So this allowed me to highlight people in a certain region where I lived at the time. And so that was the kind of why behind it. But in terms of finding my own voice, I think because it was similar to the interview style I mentioned and the speaking style, I think it just started what became my voice. So when if you go in there, it's storytelling style again. It's there's a Q&A component, which again goes back to interviewing in the book. It's also, again, I work comedy in. You know, when I'm doing an interview, if there's comedy that something comes out, we're laughing about something, that goes into the book. And so I think I probably discovered the voice that I still have today in those first books. But it was basically because I was learning. The books are kind of written as a result of interviews. So it was like, again, I think about it that I definitely probably have a unique style as to how I kind of tackle books that I wasn't really thinking about. And the other thing I do, which wasn't really done with that book, but I recommend this to people. If you have a book, if you have a certain style of book that you love reading, so for example, I really love the books from the 30s and 40s, like the old style, like so Think and Grow Rich and How to Win Friends and Influence People. So what I do when I'm writing, when I wrote the book of Why, I would only read books from that era, nothing else. Now, I didn't want to copy anything, but I wanted to write so it felt like I was born in that era and writing in that era. And so again, I didn't. If you go through the book, you won't find anything I copied or took from anybody, but you'll find a writing style. So like Napoleon Hill in Think and Grow Rich, if he's sharing a story, he'll say, "Consider this." You know, that's how he starts. So I was doing that kind of stuff. Like, consider this. John Jameson used to work at a factory, and then I'll tell a story about how, you know, John. I'm making this up, but how John Jameson went from a factory to owning the factory. But the story is told more in like a certain voice. And then when I wrote The Enlightened Passenger, I was reading a lot of Augmentino. So again, I immersed myself in that style of book. And then I wrote the book. So one of the things nobody's ever told me that they've done, or I've never heard anybody say they do it, is actually to read only the style you want to write. Because I think if that's what you're reading, that's how you're going to write, because that's all you're hearing. So that's the voice you're going to have. It's like if you went to France and, you know, learned French. Well, that if you keep hearing only French and you can't, nobody can speak English, eventually you're probably going to start speaking French. In fact, you may even pick up a bit of an accent. So I think if you immerse yourself in one thing, then that's probably going to be what the output is. So I really wanted it to be a certain feel and vibe. And so I literally just read that kind of stuff the whole time.
Beautifully articulated, Mr. Corey. You've written columns for Forbes and Entrepreneur. How does writing an 800-word column differ from writing a 200-page book? Do you have a s do you have to shift into a different mode of thinking?
Yes and no. So I kind of mentioned that I already try to write in a style where it's succinct, and I literally go through and I'll trim stuff out. Like I kind of go through stuff when I'm editing and I'll go, okay, what are all the words that can now come out of this and it still makes sense? Because what I found is, and this, by the way, I learned from writing for magazines, is that usually they'll tell you, okay, you have 500 word count or 800 word count, meaning if it's longer than that, they're going to tell you to trim it down. And if you refuse to keep trimming it down, they're just going to say, sorry, we don't need your article. So you learn that this article that I wrote, it was 1,500 words for a different place. you go, okay, is there a way I can take that to 500 words and it still be as impactful? And what I discovered is you can actually, it often becomes more impactful when you remove all the stuff that was there that didn't need to be there. So what magazines taught me is how to actually write, like how to edit words out that you normally would just say as extra words. So for example, if you were talking, you might say, let me think. So what I think about that is, well, the let me think doesn't need to be in your writing. So go back and say, what are the parts that don't need to be here? Well, it taught me about trimming all that stuff out. And then the interesting part is I kind of mentioned, I carried that over to my writing. So if I'm writing a story, I could make that story 3,000 words, or I could also make that story 700. So I constantly try to work to trim and edit to make it 700. So I think the mindset now is the same for me. But to answer your original question, the mindset was way different when I started. I didn't understand. Like I was right. I was always going to write that 1,500 or 2,000 word thing for Forbes when they only wanted 500. That's how I started. I'm like, no, it all has to be said. I can't remove anything. And they would say, well, then you can't be in Forbes. So then I had to keep working harder and harder. And then eventually I realized another thing I realized, which I'll say eventually, but eventually I realized what was happening too is I was including too much. So if I was talking about one topic, I would include 6 things about that topic when I could have just focused on one. So it's almost like a TED talk. When I've helped people and guided them with landing a TED talk or delivering it, especially, the first thing people want to do when they're crafting their TED talk is squeeze everything about flying cars into their talk. And what I would say is focus on one thing. So, for example, if flying cars, let's say, is the thing you're talking about, focus on what's the main accident that's been happening when they've been testing flying cars. If we knew that, and then focus on that one thing and make that your talk instead of focusing on every aspect of a flying car and when they started and when the last one was flown and when the last one was taken off the air and all that stuff. Like get it down to that one central thing. So I think writing a magazine article teaches you how to do that.
Mr. Corey, to wrap up our discussion for today, if you were to look at the arc of your 40 books, from anthology chapters to Enlightened Passenger, what thread connects them all? What is the one question you have been trying to answer your entire career?
Wow, that's a great question. I feel like if I tried to find a through line or a one central thing, I feel it's like at the heart of it, how can we I'm going to sum it up this way and say, how can we be a better version of ourselves?
A better version of you.
Yeah.
Definitely. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books, your business, or whatever you want to promote on Book One Review?
Yeah, so if people want to learn more about Blue Talks, we kind of mention it in passing, and some of those books are up on the screen as well. Blue Talks, you can find more about it at bluetalks.com. So it's pretty easy. It's blue without the E, though. Blue, BLU, talks.com. And if you want to find out more about me, you can go to Corey Poirier Media.com. And on both of those places, that has most of the social links. So instead of me giving you one by one all the places I'm on social media, go to either of those pages, shoot me a message, and or click on the link on, let's say, LinkedIn or Facebook, and reach out there as well.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Corey Poirier, because if you support him for sure, more and more empowering advocacy like this to rise. So, I have one more question, Mr. Corey. For the aspiring writer listening who feels they have book inside them but doesn't know where to start, what is the simplest next step you would offer to base on everything you've learned about writing process?
Okay, so I would love to give an answer that's nobody's ever shared in the show. I'd love to give an answer that super sexy and it changes everything for them. But I'm probably going to give an answer, if you've asked that question before, that you've got almost every time, which is nothing starts until you start. So really, at the end of the day, it's getting those first words somewhere. And they don't have to be great. I will add this. You're going to edit over and over again. They don't have to be great. And as Zig Ziglar said, you don't have to start to become great, but you do have to become, you don't have to be great to start, but you have to start if you want to become great. So you have to start for it to start. So I would say get the first words written is probably the most important thing or advice you'll ever hear. And then the other thing I'll add to that is just remember this too. If you have a book that nobody ever sees, even if it's brilliant, it's not impacting as many lives as that mediocre book that's on Amazon. So get into action, start writing. And even if it takes you a lot longer than you plan, just keep going at it. And whether it means writing every day or once a week or whatever your schedule allows, just keep doing it, meaning just keep plugging at it. And regardless of how long it takes, it eventually will happen. You can't write forever and not have a book.
Beautifully articulated, Mr. Corey, Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a pleasure.
And people, Mr. Corey will be my feature author of the month of May, so please tune in for that. And more to come, people. See you soon.